Hey, it's me, John Beckerman, and you are watching the Letterman podcast with Mike Chisholm. And coincidentally, I am Mike Chisholm. That's your bit, right? That's your bit.
That's my bit.
I'm doing your bit.
La, la, la.
Welcome once again to the Letterman podcast. My name is Mike Chisholm. Before we get going on this episode today, happy Thanksgiving. It's mostly an American audience that listen to or watch, or at least are brave enough to admit that they listen to or watch this show. And it's Thanksgiving down there. Of course, I'm Canadian, as Paul would be fond of saying, early harvest. We celebrated our Thanksgiving last month. By the way, happy birthday to Paul Schaefer on Thanksgiving itself. Thanksgiving Thursday is Paul's birthday, so happy birthday to him. I really enjoy this episode a lot because we are focusing on Carson the Magnificent, Bill Zehme's book. Now, I want to be very, very clear about something here. Not a Carson expert by any stretch of the imagination. Mark Malkoff is. Mark Malkoff hosted the Carson podcast for years, hundreds of episodes, a beautiful, definitive body of work in itself. This episode is not... it's more anecdotal. It's a couple of people who have come on here. We have Allison Lips, television historian, friend of our show. And she has come on to talk about her perspective when it comes to Johnny. She read the book as well recently. And then Rob Cates runs as the admin of a bunch of Facebook groups that have tens of thousands of members. The David Letterman fans Facebook group, that's Rob Cates's group. He's also got one about late night Johnny Carson. He's got one about the Rat Pack as well. Again, tens of thousands of members, and just it's three people getting together who just read Bill Zehme's book, Carson the Magnificent, and just want to talk about it. And now this book here, I want to be very, very clear. A lot of people might not know the history of this book. You'll get that in the foreword. Bill Zehme, writer for all sorts of publications back in the day, unabashed fan, admirer of Johnny Carson. And the fact that he signed this book deal so many years ago, around the time of Carson's retirement, he had the one interview with Johnny after Johnny retired. And so a lot of folks my age who have been looking forward to this book to come out for a long time. Everyone was talking about, when's the Zehme book going to come out? When's the Zehme book coming out? I think Bill Carter and I talked about that when on one of his appearances on this show. So it finally came out. Unfortunately, Bill passed away, and one of his collaborators, Mike Thomas, finished the book and released it. So the book is out, and it's interesting hearing the reaction from folks about this book. Here's the thing that I'll say about it. Are there other more definitive volumes about Johnny Carson that have been released? Yeah, I think it's safe to say that there are a couple of different biographies. But for those who don't know Johnny the way that, say, my dad's generation knew Johnny, I think this book is a fantastic entry point because it is written from the perspective of a fan. There's a lot of very cool tidbits in this book, and I enjoy them. I enjoyed it immensely. And so Allison and Rob and I got together and we said, let's have an episode where we talk about, yes, so there's lots of Letterman in this episode because we talk about comparisons between the two. We talk about, because I mean, if you do enjoy David Letterman, you will know that he absolutely was inspired by, and in many respects, his career, the responsibility of his career can fall back to Johnny Carson. Johnny Carson, really at the end of the day was the inspiration for Dave to move from Minneapolis to California. And then not only that, in that building of his career, he built a relationship with Johnny Carson to the point where, more than a mentor, somebody who gave Dave his shots. Dave spent a lot of time guest hosting The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. And I mean, so this is a fun episode where we just get a chance to talk about this book. I highly recommend it for anybody who loves this stuff or enjoys this stuff. Certainly anybody who watches or listens to this show, I think that you will enjoy Carson the Magnificent by Bill Zehme. It's a really neat book, and I just really enjoyed the conversation that we have here with Allison and Rob. So without further ado, please enjoy the conversation about Carson the Magnificent and more with myself and Rob and Allison. Allison and Rob, it is great to have you here. We were talking just before I hit record here about how we all have our different little perspectives on this thing that we love. Of course, this is the Letterman podcast, but with the Letterman podcast, it spreads out to all sorts of different things. Dave has never, ever shied away with his gratitude. It's funny, we're recording this on Thanksgiving. He has never shied away with his gratitude and reverence, of course, for the mentorship, both afar and then directly with Johnny Carson. And Carson the Magnificent came out a few weeks ago. Bill's book finally after all that time came out. And Allison, I knew we wanted to do a show on this, and I wanted to talk to both of you specifically on it. Allison, I haven't ever shied away from the fact that you are a television historian, but in a generation that's looking at it now. Whereas Rob and I are more, it's in the rearview mirror, and we like to focus on the things of the past and whatnot. And you like to take some of these things. I mean, Johnny Carson, he retired in 92, 93.
Yes.
Rob and I remember that very, very, very well. Rob, of course, you're in television yourself, a director for news in Michigan, things like that. But at the end of the day, and give us the call sign, Rob. What station are you affiliated with?
It's WLNS. It's the CBS affiliate in Lansing, Michigan. So I direct their newscasts.
Right on. Very cool. And then also, of course, the admin of Facebook pages that have tens of thousands of members to do with late night television, to do with David Letterman, the David Letterman fans, of course, being a chief one, but also Frank Sinatra and these amazing mainstays of yesteryear. All of us have this, this love for culturally significant, impactful broadcasters of the past. We have this reverence. We want to talk about it. Carson the Magnificent came out. All of us had an interest in it. All of us have read the book already, and we're excited for the book. Allison, one of the things that you said to me was, as you read the book, because you've read, the volumes of text that you have read in becoming a historian for this thing. One of the things that you said to me was the making of the book was almost more interesting than the book itself. And
Yes.
I loved how you said that. Maybe we can get into it right here. What did you two think of Carson the Magnificent? Let's start with you, Allison.
It's a great book if you just want to walk down memory lane, or if you haven't read anything on Carson before. I felt like it focused, I have it right next to me. I felt like it focused mostly on his marriages more than on the show. So that we know he wasn't the best husband in the world. So I didn't find that to be illuminating anything new. And a lot of the book is about the story of the book, how Bill Zehme was writing this book. It was going to be his life's work, and then he passed away before he could complete it. So his friend, Mike Thomas, came in and finished it. I haven't read any of Bill's books before, but I have read Mike's book on Phil Hartman.
Yep.
I like his writing style, but the two of them have different writing styles. So Mike had to come clean at the beginning and be forthright about, listen, we have two different writing styles. Like 90% of this is Bill, but I'm writing it in my style, the remaining 10%. Which, it's fine. We know the story, but again, the book's partially enjoyable because of that story. Like, this is the culmination of a man's life.
Yes. I wanted to get your perspective first because Rob and I have a very different perspective on this book. Rob, Okay, so Rob, who has so much reverence for this thing that we love, Johnny Carson in particular, a lot of reverence here. How long have we been waiting for the for the Zehme book to come
Oh,
out?
I was waiting 5 years for this book.
And you were
So
okay,
I'm
and
with
that's
you.
you from your perspective. I mean, years ago, this book was announced years and years and years
Yes.
ago, and it finally came out. And again, it's one of those things. Rob, yeah, let's get your perspective on that, Rob.
Well, yeah, it has definitely been a long wait. To be frank, I thought it would be a longer book. I think it's about 300 pages.
Yeah.
So, I kind of thought it might be more in depth. It's very good. I haven't finished it completely. I'm about halfway through it, but
Okay.
I really I'm enjoying it, and it does have a lot of information that I didn't know about. But if you want to know about Johnny, there are so many other books, and it's nice because I think that there's been kind of a renaissance and an interest in Johnny in the past probably 10 years or so, because there was the Henry Bushkin book that came out, the guy they called Bombastic Bushkin. And that is
Yes.
a different perspective because he actually worked for Johnny as his lawyer. He was his tennis partner. He was his best friend. He was his confidant. So for 18 years, Bushkin worked directly for Johnny. And so that was kind of a warts and all book. And then this one by Zehme is more of people have said it's more of a fanboy book. Yeah. So that's a big difference there.
Yeah, I mean,
I've read the Bushkin book, and I feel like they kind of complement each other, but they also cover a lot of the same events from different perspectives.
Yeah, and I mean, the reason that I connect so well with this book, and I think it's probably obvious, as the host of this show, unabashedly, excitedly, I talk about how we are a celebration of the greatest body of broadcast work in history, that of David Letterman and company. You can't do that without being an enthusiast of this stuff. And
So wait,
Zehme, I
Mike,
mean, yeah, yes.
you took the show back from Darren?
Yeah, I took the show back. Sorry, Darren.
So does this make you Jay Leno?
Oh no. Oh no. How long have you been waiting to say that? Oh, you've been sitting in the bush with that one. You've been waiting.
No, it was just 5 seconds ago. And it's
The last time Allison was on, Darren guest hosted. Um, you know, at the end of the day, I look at Zehme, who a writer in his own, would write for Rolling Stone and I think Esquire and other major publications of the day, but had this. I believe he represented a lot of people in the sense that he worshiped Johnny Carson, that Johnny Carson was a mainstay in his DNA. And Dave would talk about this, and I feel the way that Dave talks about Johnny, that's how I feel towards Dave. He was the constant. He was the guy at the end of the day, who would tuck you in and
yes.
basically kind of lead you off to end the day, talking about the headlines of the day, talking to people within entertainment or show business of the day, and really created the blueprint for late night talk shows in how we even view them now. It was Johnny Carson who did it, but he also did it in a way that is so much bigger than I think. Allison, people of your generation, people who watch television now, think about that. Like, you think about appointment television and it almost doesn't exist anymore. Johnny was a guy that would get tens of millions of people watching every single night, communal moments where the next morning when you go to work, it's one of the things that you would talk about. He would create that every single day. It was such a big thing. And Bill, who was a writer, worshipped Johnny. He was a huge fan of Johnny, and to be able to, and I could relate to his writing because he would talk about these meetings that he would have with Johnny. And one of the things that I did appreciate about the book that I do find different than any of the other materials that I've read is the fact that he got a chance to talk to Johnny after retirement. And that is a very rare occurrence. Johnny kind of disappeared from public, and you didn't
Yes.
hear very much about him afterwards. That's the stuff in the book that I found most compelling. I don't know about either of you two, but that's the stuff that I was I was ravenous for. I wanted to know some of these stories about Johnny after retirement, how he viewed things, how he viewed life. That was some of the stuff that really, really impacted me. How about you two?
But that was also like the first 50 pages, and then it veers off into other things. That's why, like Rob said, I thought this was going to be a much bigger book than it
Yeah.
is. I was thinking it was going to be more like the upcoming Lauren book,
Yep.
which is a 600-page tome. Uh, so that was fascinating, but that was not the focus of the book. That was the intro to the book. The book does jump around from time period to time period.
Mm-hmm.
I also think part of the challenge in writing the book was Johnny was not an open book. All we really know is his appearances on The Tonight Show and his marriages because those made tabloid headlines.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we're working with. And then one of his sons, I think it was Chris, mentioned, like, yeah, he wasn't a great father. I still loved him, but he was giving his all to the nation, and there wasn't much left for the kids and his wives.
Mm-hmm. Rob, I think you're probably the same as me when it comes to the idea of the fact that Johnny did have a life after the show, but it was not a public life at all. And it was something that we all wanted. Even when he signed off, he said, you know, I hopefully will be able to find something that where I can come back and see you and whatnot. And it never really happened. I mean, the only time it ever happened was on Dave's show.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, he was on Dave's show. He had the I think it was 1993. He had the Kennedy Center honors, and so that was televised. And Doc was on there. They had the University of Nebraska marching band on there that came out and played Johnny's theme song. So he enjoyed that. But Johnny went out on top, and that's what he wanted to do. He knew that nothing else could compare to his body of work, and he had many opportunities. I heard that somebody pitched him an idea to do a show about animals because he loved having Joan Embry on the show and he loved having Jim Fowler on the show. And after retirement, it was said that he went to Africa on a safari with Jim Fowler.
Mm-hmm.
But he said no to that, obviously, but he had many different things that were pitched to him. But yeah, just like you, I'm curious about what he did after retirement. We hear a little bit about his yacht. He had a yacht called Serengeti that was 130 feet long. And so he spent a lot of time on that yacht, Serengeti, named after that part in Africa, which he loved. And another thing, when he went to Africa, this shows his intelligence. He learned Swahili when he went to Africa, so he could communicate with the people there. And he took a trip to Russia and he learned some Russian. So people sometimes don't realize the depth of intelligence that Johnny had. Yes, he was a great entertainer. He was a very funny guy. He was a great comedian, but he was also a very intelligent guy and very well-rounded. I mean, he loved astronomy, so he loved having Carl Sagan on the show. He was an avid drummer. He just loved jazz music and he loved drumming. And so many times he had Buddy Rich on the show, and there are just like endless YouTube videos of Buddy Rich on the show that are just priceless. So he loved tennis. He had a tennis court across the street from his house. He had a tunnel underneath his house, and then you'd come up and you would be at the tennis court. So yeah, when he was living in Malibu at Point Doom, up on the bluff overlooking the Pacific Ocean. So yes, like you, I was very curious about what he did in retirement. It mentioned in the book that a couple of his writers, Mulholland and Barry, they got a chance to go on his yacht. They got to see the Serengeti, and so did David Letterman. Letterman has talked about that a couple of times, about what a monumental experience that was for him, especially for Letterman being able to be on that yacht with Johnny. Yeah.
Yeah, I also actually I wrote down here in my notes here the Mulholland and Barry on the yacht with an exclamation point was the note I put on there, and the idea, like after retirement, and Peter Lasalle talks about this. If you watch the tribute show, the tribute late show that David Letterman and company put on in '05, about a week after the passing of Johnny Carson, and I highly recommend it. If you go to, you can find it online, and it's in pieces from different places. The definitive place to see the tribute show, the tribute late show to Johnny Carson, is on Don Giller's channel. Now, Don Giller has a compilation series. I believe it's 7 parts, and it's talk show. It's the talk show compilation, and basically it's every talk show host you could think of, and their history with David Letterman's productions from late night all the way to the end of Late Show. And there's one that focuses on all of Johnny's appearances. And I think it's the last one that that with Johnny, that focuses on Johnny, that has everything to do with Late Show. So it's as soon as Dave left CBS or NBC, went to CBS, and Johnny's last real appearance on TV was on Late Show with David Letterman. And when Dave went up to California, he came out on stage, was going to read the top 10 list. Now here's where I get conflicting stories. I've talked to people who were there, and there were some people who say Johnny had no voice. He had laryngitis that night. And then there are some people who said, yeah, no, you can even hear Johnny talk a little bit in that exchange, just a little teeny tiny bit. You can hear him talk. It had nothing to do with laryngitis. He was overcome with emotion. He came out. Dave got him to sit at the desk. He sat at the desk. The ovation went on and on and on and on. It's been, years, 18 months, whatever it was, since Johnny has signed off. And he was so overcome that he couldn't talk. So I've heard both stories about that. And I don't know which is true, which isn't. But yeah, the idea of going on that yacht, Barry and Mulholland and other people too as well. Rory Rosegarten was on here last week, and he talked about how Romano and Phil Rosenthal got a chance to go and hang out. I think that's who it was. Got to hang out on the yacht, and that's one of the things that he envies in life, is that he's had some Johnny Carson moments, but the fact that they got to go and have lunch with him on the yacht was a huge thing. Rob, talk about, because I get with Facebook, you see with your Facebook groups, you see the activity that are going on in this. There's still a contingent of people after all of these years. It's astounding. YouTube didn't exist back then. Really at the end of the day, it talks about it, the very first Tonight Show, and years worth of Carson's material doesn't exist anymore. They were literally videotaped over, or lost or thrown away.
First 10 years.
The first 10 years. And I mean, doesn't exist, but yet there is still this love for Johnny, this reverence for Johnny, because that's how big of a star he was. Actually, this is a good one for both of you. I've been racking my brain to try and find, I'm Canadian, but I understand the SAT comparison questions. This is to that, what this is to that. I'm trying to figure out who we can, to the modern audience, compare Johnny Carson to. I don't know if there is anybody. I mean, he was the biggest star on the planet. Literally tens of millions of people would watch him every night. Who is a comparison in today's standards for Johnny Carson?
We're
I
too
really don't know.
fractured.
You don't know. We're too fractured. What do you mean by we're too fractured, Allison?
We all have found the niches of things we watch. So there aren't any events where we get together, watch them communally. Granted, we're all in our houses, but we know water cooler talk we talk about in my classes. That doesn't exist anymore, because it used to be like, oh, I watched Friends last night, or I watched All in the Family, depending on what decade you're in. And you would talk about that at the water cooler. And now it's more, oh, did you watch that? No, you should. And we're recommending things to each other. And we all have watch lists where it's like, yeah, let's be honest, not watching what you just told me to add to my watch list. There's so much content out there.
So it is incredible how much things are fractured, definitely.
So the closest that we get, at least in the United States, is the Super Bowl,
Mm-hmm.
but that's not even in the same category. It's like apples and tables. Like, yeah, they're both objects or they're both TV shows, but they're not category. Like, what, they both have carbon? Like,
Yeah. Yeah, it's not the same thing. I mean, the Academy Awards, they say, which Johnny hosted a few times. I mean, that's a communal thing where a lot of people get together and watch it, but I'm a little
not
suspect
as
of the
much as it.
numbers of that even still. I don't know. I don't know if that's the case, but I'm trying to think of a star like back then. I mean, Frank Sinatra, Taylor Swift. I mean, would that be it? Would that be a comparison? I don't know. Like people see how I think it's safe to say most people can understand how big Taylor Swift is now. I mean, the
I think
ecosystem that she has is astounding.
that's an interesting comparison. I think that might be a good one. Again, Taylor Swift is a musical artist, so
Yeah.
it's probably more appropriate to compare that to Beatlemania than it would be to like get curling under the blankets and watching Johnny Carson before you go to bed.
Oh yeah, no, I said Frank Sinatra, and I said Frank on purpose because Rob, I mean, you've also got the Frank Sinatra Facebook group that has tens of thousands of people who still have this reverence for Frank. Because at the time, I mean, Frank and Johnny, it might be safe to say that Frank and Johnny were the two biggest stars on earth. Would you say that would be,
Oh yeah, oh
realistic?
yeah, and it said I think it was in Bushkin's book that it talked about how very seldom was Johnny overwhelmed or starstruck, but he was by Frank Sinatra. Johnny had such reverence for Frank, and it's a generational thing. Yeah, when Johnny was growing up, he loved Frank's music, and yeah, so that he was very rarely just blown away by people, but he was kind of intimidated. And Frank had he asked Johnny to give a speech at Ronald Reagan's inauguration, and Johnny knew he couldn't really say no to Frank Sinatra. But and Frank hosted Johnny's show, but it was only once, and he
Yeah.
didn't do a monologue. He came out and sang. But there have been so many incredible guest hosts of Johnny's show since he had so much time off. But yeah, definitely, as you said, Mike, it was so different with Johnny Carson. It was appointment television. People would talk about it around the water cooler. And back then, I mean, if you're talking about like the 1970s, which was really his peak,
Mhm.
there were three networks and that was it. And he ruled. And there were so many people that came in and tried to topple him off of that throne. But he was number one. And it's when you look at his 1980 contract, NBC knew that he was just a cash cow for that network. They knew that they had to throw everything at him, tons of vacation time, tons of money. They trimmed the show from 90 minutes down to 60 minutes, which I think was kind of too bad because when you watch the 90-minute shows, oh, those were spectacular. Some of those 90-minute shows, they were so packed with entertainment. As long as you had good guests, and he did have outstanding guests. But if it was a 90-minute show, he could have a musical guest that would do a couple songs plus have time to talk with Johnny for a segment. He'd have like 4 or 5 guests on there. He had plenty of time for the monologue, for a comedy piece of the desk. Those 90-minute shows were really something special. And I think if people like Johnny, they need to look at the shows from the 1970s, especially when he first moved to Burbank, like 1972, 73, 74. And there are some full episodes of those on YouTube, and they're fantastic. There are some full episodes from New York on there too, and yes, most of them from the New York era, 1962 to 72. Most of them were recorded over because videotape was expensive, and they didn't really think about archiving things back then. But it's not 100% of the shows that were recorded over, but I don't know what the percentage is, 95%. But there's not many from that for the first 10 years.
No,
Right.
go ahead.
We're lucky we even have audio from the very first
Sure.
Tonight Show starring
Yeah,
Johnny
there's no
Carson.
video. It was just audio. Yeah, and he was introduced by Groucho Marx. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, again, different time period at the time, but back then, one of the things that I was fascinated about was even back then when the Tonight Show with Johnny Carson started. Of course, Johnny took over for Jack Parr. We'll get to Jack Parr here in a minute because I mean Jack Parr is a legend in his own right, and it's interesting. They both died within a year of each other. Parr died in '04, Johnny Carson died in '05, and another interesting thing out of the book. I don't know if this is mentioned in Bushin's book. I kind of don't think so. Jack Parr and Johnny Carson enjoyed an email relationship after the fact. Near the end during the yacht years, he and Jack had a relationship via email, and they would go back and forth with each other. But the idea that
That was
go ahead.
wild to me because yes, I know when they both died, but these are people who I'm used to seeing on black and white television, and the fact
Yeah.
that they were communicating through email in the early 2000s is one
Charming,
of those
right?
things like, yeah, it's like, oh, okay.
That's what I thought too. I thought that was totally charming. I was tickled by that.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, to go back to Rob's point, Groucho Marx, the first 15 minutes of the Tonight Show, because it was more than 90 minutes for an extended period of time at the beginning, because the first 15 minutes would only be broadcast to New York. And so they would have a kind of a mini show, an intro show, and you had first Groucho Marx or Ed McMahon, or people would come in and do things to kind of introduce the show just for those people, and then the rest of the country would see kind of when the show started 15 minutes later. But even and I forget what year it was. I might have it written down here, but the idea that it wasn't till 1967. So he started the show in what, 62, right?
62, yes.
And it wasn't until 1967 that the entire country got to see the Tonight Show the same night. West of Michigan, I think it was, or whatever. They saw the show the next day. They got to see, the previous nights the next day. It was the East Coast that got to see, the first run of it. But then after that, they didn't have the technology available to show the show to broadcast the show that same night until 1967. Like, you think about it, and that's not that long ago. I was born in 76. Okay, so that's less than a decade before what we're talking about here. Technology, Rob, well, gosh, Rob, you're in television directly. The technical evolution that you have seen in your career is astounding. And you think about that, but yet at the same time, Johnny was still that big of a star in that community. We talk about this communal stuff. I found that astounding as well, that it was 1967 when that happened.
Yeah. A lot of people don't realize that the Tonight Show for a while, it was 1 hour and 45 minutes, and then got trimmed down to an hour 30. And then in 1980, it got trimmed down to 60 minutes. But so for those first 15 minutes, oftentimes Johnny would not participate. A lot of times it was just Ed and Skitch Henderson, the music director, and just kind of killing time and just BSing and talking about whatever. So back then, and this is a weird thing to think about too, back then, a lot of the local TV stations, they would have 15-minute newscasts, and that was it. And so then they expanded to 30-minute newscasts, a lot of them. And then, so as you said, 1967, finally, the show became 90 minutes. And 90-minute shows were more popular back then. I was thinking about it. How many 90-minute shows are there today? I mean, I know that there's Saturday Night Live. I know that there's CBS Sunday Morning, but there are very few and far between. But
And there's all 12 hours of the Today Show.
Yeah,
the Today Show. Yeah, that's right.
A lot of time. Yeah.
Yeah. And programs that that have news attached to them. But if you think about actual entertainment shows, not very many at all. Like, my wife and I enjoy Survivor. I understand why CBS would extend that show out, because when you're doing a reality show, you have so much footage that it just that never sees the light of day, and it's pretty easy to cut a reality show into a 90-minute deal. And if you've got one that's getting ratings these days, why not? I can kind of see that, but that's kind of the reason that they did that is it's a cost saving measure in many respects to do that. You don't see you see very few shows that go beyond an hour these days, and this is something that dominated, you know, a 90-minute deal dominated for what was it, 20 out of 30, 20 out of Johnny's 30 years were 90-minute shows, something like that, or close to that, something like that.
Yeah, 18 years. Yeah,
18 years.
first 18 years. Yeah.
Oh,
So it is amazing that the technology you think about. And then if you go back even further than Johnny, when you look at the really early TV shows like your Show of Shows or Texaco Star Theater, shows like that, they were live because they didn't have videotape. So Sid Caesar and Carl Reiner and people like that, they had to get used to working live without a net because they were not going to videotape things and then show it the next day. So when you think of the talent of people like that, and their writing staffs were incredible. I mean, Woody Allen wrote for some of those early TV shows, Mel Brooks. So it's incredible when you think about the technology with that, how it changed like from 1950 to 1970, huge changes.
Yeah. Allison, what were you gonna say?
I don't remember what I was say. I was listening to Rob.
Yeah, I just the book, that's one of the things, and to capture the spirit of the book here, to go back, that was one of the things that I think I appreciated the most. It reminded me of what television used to be. And I think I'm not lamenting, I'm not necessarily saying it's, oh, go ahead. What were you gonna say?
I remember what I was going to say. So you said what television used to be. We also didn't address that, yes, there were 90-minute shows, but even the 60-minute shows then are longer than what an hour show would be now because of commercials. If you're watching an hour-long show, there's 20 minutes of commercials. If you're watching an extended version of Survivor or The Voice, there's 40 minutes of commercials. Yep. And yes, there were commercials then, but there were fewer commercials. A lot of the commercials, depending on how far back you go, were part of the show. I'm sure most of us have seen the Johnny and the Alpo.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Which was part of the show. It was Ed McMahon doing a commercial. The dog wouldn't behave, so Johnny became the dog.
Yeah, that was common. That was just part of Ed's job to do those commercials. And yeah, things have changed so much. And yeah, you look at the commercial time in TV now. One thing I think of is the TV shows used to have these elaborate opening credit sequences, and now they don't have those. You look at, like, for instance, Happy Days from back in the 70s. Their opening credit sequence was great. It showed all the different actors and their names on there. And you just don't have that anymore. And they don't have time for that because they have to pack in so many commercials.
Yeah. And I mean, anybody who watches, some of the old, go to Don Giller's channel or it's funny because the official Letterman YouTube channel doesn't encapsulate this as much, because when they'll show a clip on there, many times it's one segment, and the beginning, middle, end of the video is the segment of say an actor who might be in the news right now, or somebody who passed away. They'll show a segment of Dave talking to that, to that subject. Even if they put both segments on there, they'll put one segment on, then a quick flash, where the commercial would be, and then they put the other one on, and it seems like a full clip. Well, if you go back to Late Night with David Letterman, so if you go to Don Giller's channel and you watch these things unedited, even the interview segments there was time to actually have a conversation. And even with Late Night, it was starting to become more truncated compared to Johnny. And Rob, to your point earlier, I totally agree. I mean, Johnny was the ultimate conversationalist. He was, and he would make every conversation entertaining. And like the book said, all he had to do was a look to the camera. He would look into the camera, like a knowing look, where he would slightly break the fourth wall. That sort of thing. But he would converse with these people.
That's Jack Benny. That's his Jack Benny influence.
Okay, go into that a little bit, because again, we're talking about Johnny Carson to a generation of people who are like, okay, yeah. Talk about Jack Benny for a second there, Allison.
I'm pretty sure Johnny has acknowledged that at some point where he would look into the camera and like Jack Benny would do.
Jack Benny
And
was a huge
Johnny,
influence on Johnny. Johnny
yes,
loved Jack. Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Um, so I'm not really sure where you want me to go with this, Mike.
Well, no, I don't know. You're the historian in the fact that, like Jack Benny again was gigantic as well. Like
Yes,
he was a iconic at that point in television. He's the
yes.
guy, again, let's go back to the SAT thing. Jack Benny was to Johnny Carson what Johnny Carson was to David Letterman. I think that's a fair assessment.
Also, when we're going back to Jack Benny and George Burns and all of those people, we're also going back to vaudeville and the
Mhm.
early instances of television that were heavily vaudeville. They were live. And that's why when I was reading the book, I did not realize that The Tonight Show with starring Johnny Carson wasn't live for most
Mhm.
of its run because I'm used to um television at that point in time being live or being recorded on film, like I Love Lucy.
Mhm.
Because while I love and respect Johnny when it comes to The Tonight Show, I'm more of a Steve Allen person,
Yeah.
which his show was live. We got 90 minutes. We've talked about this before. The things he was doing, Steve was doing to kill time, Letterman was doing. We could look at what we're doing on NBC's dime. We're wasting airtime.
Mhm. Mhm.
So, but getting back to Jack Benny, I think it's like the early vaudeville influence Jack Benny, Johnny Carson, because Johnny Carson also is partially because he was on television for 30 years, but well, The Tonight Show for 30 years, but he's the bridge between the two eras. I don't think there's anyone else who lasted that long on television. Sure, Steve Allen popped up on PBS in the 90s with Meeting of the Minds, but that was hardly relevant to the majority of people.
Mhm.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Jack Benny was really Johnny Carson's hero. I do know that. And then as Mike was saying, it's like each generation, a lot of times they admired the generation that came before them.
Mhm.
David Letterman looked up so much to Johnny Carson, and we know how Jimmy Kimmel idolizes David Letterman.
There we
He
go.
really,
Yes.
ever since he was a little kid, he just idolized David Letterman. And I mean, when Johnny was in college, he wrote a term paper that was all about how to write comedy. And he referenced Jack Benny a lot in there, and also Fred
Yes.
Allen, who was another well-known radio star back in the day. My dad loved Fred Allen. My dad was born in 1931, so
Mhm.
he would talk to me about the 1940s when Jack Benny and Fred Allen were very, very popular on the radio. So yeah, and then
Yes.
people like that, people like Fred Allen or Jack Benny, they were influenced by vaudeville. And it's like every generation kind of builds on it. And yes, they do borrow some things. Johnny borrowed some of his things from people who came before him, but it's fascinating to look at the history of all that, and definitely how far we've come. Yeah.
I'm really glad you brought up the idea of these bridges, and they are all like these long-standing hosts are all bridges from between eras. You look at and I love that, Allison. Thank you for noting that the idea of bridging from live to as technology increases, the shows change, and the Tonight Show went through monumental changes, and then of course Letterman did the same thing, and then he homaged Johnny, and then to Rob's point, that's exactly right. I was astounded listening to the Strike Force 5 podcast, and I highly recommend that. It's still I popped it in when I was making a long drive recently. I listened to a couple of the episodes again. The Strike Force 5 podcast was the five main hosts of today during the writers' strike, the recent last year's writers' strike. It was John Oliver, Colbert, Fallon, Seth Meyers, and Jimmy Kimmel, and they did a podcast together. The benefits went to to the writers who were striking at the time. And David Letterman was on one of those episodes, and it astounded me that none of the current stars of late night today had any encounters with Johnny Carson on his show. And what astounded me by that was Dave was kind of surprised by that. Like you could almost hear the surprise in Dave's voice. It felt, because he was like, okay, well, you all met Johnny, right? Or any of you on Johnny's show? And all of them were like, no, none of us were.
I mean, the oldest one is what, Stephen Colbert, who's what, like 60?
Yeah, something like that.
So he wouldn't have been on Carson's show unless he was one of those precocious children.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think I was trying to think about this because Rory was talking about that with Ray Romano. Ray Romano was on Carson. Ellen DeGeneres was on Carson. There are still people who are in the mainstay today who are in the lexicon that were there, but none of them are late night hosts currently. And but the reverence is there. Conan has this reverence. That was another thing that was surprising in the book to me, was that one of the things that I loved was reading, and man, I would love Conan to talk about this. And I don't know, like, I mean, I've listened to and followed Conan quite closely. I mean, you can't see it all or hear it all these days. There's too much content, as somebody said earlier. But the idea that, this infamous time where NBC promised him the Tonight Show in 5 years, when that announcement was made in 2004 or whatever it was, Conan had a call with Johnny Carson about that.
Yeah.
And it talks about in the book how Conan, probably earnestly, in my mind, it's earnestly because of the reverence that he had for Johnny and the Tonight Show and the institution. Yeah. And he said, I'll take care of the franchise for you. And Carson had some sort of a sarcastic quip back. Oh yeah, some franchise or something, like it was something.
Yes. And also, I think we'd be remiss with mentioning Conan O'Brien and Johnny Carson without the Simpsons story of when Johnny Carson was on The Simpsons. Johnny asked Conan for directions out of the parking lot, and he gave the wrong directions.
Yeah, I love that story. That's a great story. But have you either of you heard that story before about Conan talking to Johnny when it was announced that he was going to get the Tonight Show? Was that in any of the other? That was the first I had ever heard of that.
I probably heard about that at one point, but then also I know that Conan he never did Johnny's show, but he did get a chance to meet Johnny in 1993, right around the time when Conan was doing his late night show when he was filling Letterman shoes. So he has, it was at some kind of an event. And
that was
Conan
Bob Wright's birthday, I think. I think it was Bob Wright's birthday party.
Yeah, it was. Yeah. So yeah, Conan had to give a bit of a speech, and they basically said, you're opening up for Johnny. So yeah, Conan, just go out and say a few words, and then Johnny will go after you. And Conan's like, hey, no pressure there.
You know what?
I think
go ahead, Allison. Yeah.
I think Conan may have mentioned it at the time when he got the Tonight Show on late night. That was the time when I was first discovering it, but I don't think he would have gone into details out of respect for Johnny. Just I spoke to him.
Yeah, no way. There's no way. And I mean, I listen to his podcast now. Johnny, or Conan, I should say, if you want to hear there's a really great story that he tells about The Simpsons, about the time on The Simpsons when Johnny Carson showed up. Because the thing is, Johnny loved writers' rooms, and there's something I want to get to when it comes to the writers' room. Don't let me forget the writers' room comment that came out of the book that I wanted to throw out there. But Johnny loved writers' rooms, and he hadn't been on TV for X amount of time. He shows up to The Simpsons to record the piece that he did there, and he hung out in the writers' room, and I think Conan tells the story on Conan O'Brien Needs a Friend. I believe it's on the episode that David Letterman appeared on. And he tells the story about how Johnny shows up, and this is before he leaves and Conan gives him the wrong directions. He shows up and he was so happy to be there. And I think he said he had a carton of cigarettes. And he just sat there and talked to the writers, and they had a fantastic time talking with Johnny Carson. And I found that extremely endearing. But yeah, the idea that I would love to the idea that when this infamous time was happening, Late Shift 2, Late Shift 1, the original Late Shift, obviously Johnny very much involved in that. The idea of Late Shift 2, that Johnny was even had an inkling of that before it happened, that 5-year deal. I'm so curious what Johnny would have thought of the idea of, oh yeah, you're getting the Tonight Show in 5 years. And I know Dave talked about it. He made fun of that on the air at the time. And certainly the chickens came home to roost where in 2010, when all the stuff went down, 2009, 2010. I mean, but the idea that Johnny actually had an inkling of that before he passed, I found that, I don't know, an interesting part of the story that hasn't been told before. I had either of you heard that before? I'd never heard it. You said maybe he talked about it on late night. Maybe
Might have talked about having a conversation.
Yeah.
He wouldn't have mentioned, like, it would have been something like, I spoke to Johnny and he was very supportive about this, and I appreciate him reaching out, or something like that. It wouldn't have been even the little bit of detail we got here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, and also we need to mention, as far as Conan, I'm sure you guys have heard, he's going to be the host of the Oscars next year. So he's going to be following in the footsteps of other late night hosts like David Letterman and like Johnny Carson. And so he's going to do an outstanding job. I mean, he's hosted award shows before. I think he did the Emmys, but yeah, he's going to be great as an Oscar host.
I thought the same thing, and I immediately went back to the Emmys. It's funny because the Emmys was an example of when Conan became white hot, and NBC was like, we cannot lose him, we cannot repeat history. And Johnny, in my opinion, Johnny was kind of pushed out of his job with a bunch of the circumstances that were around there. And as Peter LaSalle said, Johnny was fond of saying he didn't want to stay too long at the fair. So I believe he was kind of pushed out, and NBC was basically doing the same thing to Jay Leno, but saying in 5 years, we're going to do it. The reason being, Conan was hosting the Emmys and absolutely, grand slam home run performances, becoming white hot, having this, and this is before Team Coco. Team Coco didn't show up until he was ousted. Like he was just white hot. And
we can have a whole
go ahead.
We can have a whole conversation on how Team Coco fans are different from original Conan O'Brien fans, because there's a difference.
We'll talk about that. Talk about that.
So I started watching Conan when I was 10, which was well before Team Coco even was on anyone's mind.
Mm-hmm.
So I remember she was recording Conan on VHS because we didn't have a DVR yet.
Yep.
And watching it before I go to school while I was eating breakfast. And there are Conan sketches from that time period that I can reference, whereas people who became fans from either Team Coco or the podcast have no idea. I remember being in college at the time and people were rallying around Conan O'Brien like he got screwed over by NBC and Jay Leno, this, that, the other thing. And they were making it like a generational issue. And I'm like, they're both boomers. Like, this is not a generational issue. This is how the entertainment business works, and NBC miscalculated, and Jay has yet to figure out that he is not making cars and treats the entertainment business like he's going to work at a factory and will do what the boss says because it's what's best for the company. And people were making it something that it wasn't. And I'm also finding that if you discovered Conan through the podcast, a lot of them have those people may have never seen even the TBS show.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also a lack of curiosity on going to explore things from the past. Like I do, I think we all do, but there's a lot more past for me because I did not grow up watching David Letterman in the 80s. I was born in 91.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so there are people who are fans who maybe diehard fans who are missing half the story.
Yeah. You know what? I love that you were the first person to kind of point that out to me, Allison. And it never even occurred to me because like Rob and I, we saw Conan's entire run all the way,
Yes.
all the way up, to the current day. But I love the fact that, again, there's all these little echoes, in this show here constantly. I mean, even I just even saw Zinneman, Jason Zinneman, who New York Times comedy critic, wrote Letterman, the Last Giant of Late Night. I just even saw it the other day. It was to do with the new pants store. Oh, by the way, Worldwide Pants, there it is, represent right there.
Right.
It's one of the new David Letterman shirts that you can get at the Worldwide Pants store. And I mean,
While we're mentioning that, because we also just mentioned how old I was, the jacket I'm wearing is from '09. That's the year I graduated high school.
Oh, there you go. Yeah, you got your Worldwide Pants jacket. That's awesome. There's been a few people who since the incarnation of this show have ended up now with pants jackets, and I celebrate every single time that you get one. It's a great feeling. Rob, we got to figure out a way. You're for a CBS affiliate. You should get a pants jacket. We should figure out a way to get you one.
Yeah, definitely. That'd be cool.
But to go back to the point, with Letterman, I mean, in this show here, it's so funny how people will reach out to me. I have people who will reach out and they specifically will take time out of their day to reach out to me and say, I'm not watching this week's show because it doesn't have to do with Late Night with David Letterman. The only shows, and they will like lambaste me for saying you don't spend enough time focusing on Late Night with David Letterman. And I mean, well, it's like, hey, we'll talk about Late Night with David Letterman as much as we possibly can, but the people who worked for Late Show are a lot younger than the people who worked for Late Night in many respects. But of course, I mean, you've got people within the Letterman enthusiast camp who are like, oh, I am Late Night or die, and they plant their flag. Or some people who feel the same way about Late Show, like again Zinneman the other day, he was talking about the merch in the Worldwide Pants official store, which I highly recommend, by the way. Anybody go get yourself a David Letterman piece of merchandise, whether it's at Rupert's, at hello-deli.com, or the Worldwide Pants store. Go for it, get something. But Zinneman was like, hey, I'll buy a ton of it.
Something.
Pardon me?
Did you say get something?
I don't know, maybe. We'll have to go back and check the tape. But he I might have used it as a filler word. I don't know if I said something. Maybe I did.
But you find something completely different.
Yeah, yeah, I guess it does. A little something. Get yourself a little something at the Worldwide Pants store. But you won't be able to find any Late Night with David Letterman stuff there yet. And Zinneman said, hey, if there's a Late Night with David Letterman stuff, I'll buy it all. And it's so funny, like, just there are people who plant their flags when it comes to this stuff. And
so, weird fact, apropos of not much, when I first arrived,
you just described this show, by the way. You just described this show, apropos of not much. That should be our headline.
Your new slogan.
Yeah. Go ahead.
When I first arrived at Rowan, they had Late Night at the Rec, which is the rec center, and I don't remember what it was, like some fitness rave or whatever they do to make college students feel welcome. And I noticed immediately that the Late Night that was on it was the old David Letterman logo. So it had the Late Night logo, and in the bottom, the tail.
Yep.
It had at the Rec. I may still have it, but it's worn because I would use it as, like, I would sleep in it. So, and it's also not real late night merch.
No, but it's, again,
it was kind of fun.
It shows how it's baked into the fabric of our culture.
Right. But I may have been the only one who realized what they did.
I'm sure the designers knew
Yeah.
as well. But yeah, I love all these echoes. The idea that there are divisions within the Conan world and stuff. I don't know if Carson had that or not. I don't know if there are people back in the day who were, YouTube didn't exist, right? So there weren't
Who do
people
you
who could
trust?
say,
That's it.
yeah, VHS. And it's like, oh yeah, I loved the New York years versus I loved the Burbank years. This is a good question for Rob. Did the show, in your opinion, did the tone of the show change between the New York years and the Burbank years, Rob?
I don't really know because I haven't seen a whole lot of the New York shows. It definitely was. It was a much bigger theater. I mean, Studio One in Burbank seated 500 people, as opposed to the studio in 30 Rock was about 250 people.
6B, I
So, I mean,
believe.
you can
Yeah.
also, I guess, you could compare that to. You can look at Letterman. I mean, Letterman going from 30 Rock to the Ed Sullivan Theater, and it was just a much bigger setting. And of course, out on the West Coast, Johnny was going to get more of the movie stars, and I think when he was out east, it was probably more of the Broadway people. But no, I don't know if the tone of the show. Well, of course they did change band leaders too. There was a Skitch Henderson, and then there was a Milton DeLugg who was band leader for very briefly, and then Doc Severinsen was 25 out of the 30 years. Doc Severinsen was the band leader. So that could have been some changes too. But yeah, I understand what you're saying as far as there may be people that are, yeah, they may they like the New York years better, or going back even further, like Allison said, he was very successful before the Tonight Show. He had Who Do You Trust, which is an ABC afternoon game show,
Mhm.
and so Johnny was successful with that, and he wasn't sure if he could fill Jack Parr's shoes, and there were all of the headlines were saying, "Is Johnny up to par? Yes or no?" And Johnny's wife Joanne was really his biggest cheerleader, and so she believed in him. And but yeah, he had success with Who Do You Trust, and so he was making good money doing that and had some recognition. But also, I think that people may think that, oh, Johnny Carson, he was always rich, he was always famous. No, he had to pay his dues like everyone else. I mean, he had the Johnny Carson show, which was prime time on CBS.
Mhm.
That was not successful. He had a
Mhm.
show called Earn Your Vacation that was not successful. He had Carson Cellar, which was local on KNXT in Los Angeles, and that was in the infancy of his career. And his first marriage to Jody, they had a lot of issues, but they had financial struggles. And Johnny was not always rich and famous, so he had to pay his dues like everyone else. And yeah, Who Do You Trust was a good fit, and obviously the Tonight Show was a very good fit for him too. But yeah, people may not realize that he had his ups and downs in his career, just like anyone else.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that in the book. There's a story about Johnny and Jack Lemmon that has been retold a couple of different times throughout Johnny's career. But they take a different standpoint. Again, Bill is very much a fan. And I appreciate this book very much because it's almost like, and I mean, I would never, ever in a million years compare myself to Bill Zehme in any way, shape, or form. But it's like a guy like me writing a book about David Letterman, where there's this just massive reverence from a fan perspective and unabashedly shows it. There are times where I can talk about Dave very clinically, but he doesn't do that in this book. This book is like unabashed reverence, and I appreciate that about it compared to other volumes that have been talked about. But he, so his retelling of that Jack Lemmon story is very interesting because it was at a time where the two guys were not stars, and they were they closed down a bar together, basically just talking and talking and talking and talking, and the culmination of the story is that Jack left that meeting going, oh my God, that's going to be one of the biggest stars in the world. And it's funny how so many people saw it. I want to finish this show here today, this episode today, talking with a few comparisons between Johnny and Dave, because there are a lot of similarities. One of the similarities I had written down is exactly what you just said, Rob. Johnny had a failed show. And it's funny because just like the morning show with Dave, many people, talk about how, oh yeah, the right driver, the wrong vehicle. It's yeah, okay, this show didn't necessarily work for you, but that is not indicative of who you are. Johnny Carson is still a star on the rise, but that's just the wrong show. Don't worry, your time is coming. And a lot of people felt that way. But at the time, Johnny didn't feel that way. At the time when Dave lost the morning show, he didn't feel that way. Massive, massive uncertainty, massive scarcity, massive, confidence issues, that kind of a thing. I only knew Johnny Carson growing up as powerful Johnny. He was one of the most powerful people in show business. He, like you said earlier, Rob, he could kick a network around and say, no, you know what? I am going to work some weeks 3 nights a week. I am going to have ownership over this show. And again, we talk about this on the show all the time, how when Dave moved over to CBS, he basically took the Carson deal and just continued it for him. Because of, you talk about this power that he had back in the day. I love Kimmel now. I love how Kimmel will have guest hosts the way that Johnny used to have guest hosts on the Tonight Show. But he is basically dictating to the network what his terms are if they want to keep him. It's not the same thing that Johnny had back then, because these shows aren't, as you said, Rob, aren't nearly as profitable anymore, unfortunately, as they were back then, which is why we're seeing the decline. And we're watching change happen right in front of us, where this thing that has been around for generations, and we've talked about these hosts that have bridged the generations together, and now we're watching it where it actually is in peril, where the medium itself is actually in peril and changing, it's fascinating to watch, and for those of us who enjoy nostalgia, or make it a profession, or make it part of our daily lives, it's fascinating times, but it's also sad times a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, things are changing a lot. I mean, just look at like you said, I mean, when you look at the 1993 contract that Letterman had, you compare it to the 1980 contract. Yeah, Letterman had ownership of the Late Late Show. Well, the Late Late Show is gone now. We have After Midnight with Taylor Tomlinson, which is fine, but it's different. It's not the mold of the old late night shows. And yeah, things are changing so much. They really are, and it's kind of sad to see.
Is it sad for you, Allison, or are you more looking at it from the perspective of, like when I think of a historian, think of the academia of it, and they're just almost like a reporter. Is that how you see it, or do you have some emotional skin in the game as well?
The world that we're talking about ended pretty much when I was 18, 19. So I do miss that. However, I was young when we stopped having these monolithic talk show hosts that we all watched before we go to bed. So I'm not as, I guess, nostalgic for it, maybe. Like, I miss it. I enjoyed it. But I don't feel the need to go back to it, or I don't want it, or I'm not like, oh, I need to have this back. It's so sad that it died. It's also, I'm looking at it from the media ecosystem has changed. Everything on broadcast TV is now competing with cable, premium cable, random things on the internet, actual legitimate streaming services. Your phone. I mean, you can watch TV on 3-4 different screens at the same time, and you don't need multiple TVs next to each other.
Yeah.
So I do find it sad because it is the end of the era, but I also don't watch any of the current late night shows.
Mhm.
The only exception has been Jon Stewart Monday nights on The Daily Show, and that's the only episode of The Daily Show I will watch.
Yeah.
And that's probably because I grew up watching Jon Stewart. So that's my connection, and it's because it's new content and it was always a show meant for adult. It's not the same as like if I go watch an episode of Double Dare where it's like, yeah, this is clearly for kids.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I see.
It's like, okay, I'm an adult, I'm watching a show for an adult. I was watching Conan at 10. So I was already watching shows that were more of a part of a more adult world from a very young age.
Mhm.
Similar to how people who would watch Johnny like stay up late, the monologue, but you can watch the monologue, but then you have to go to bed.
Yep.
I mean, I was with VHS tapes because I had to get up early and I do not function well on like 4 hours of sleep. But I did have some taste of the world, but like of that world, but it ended when I was young.
Yeah, no, I get that. Yeah, it's just it's so it is very it to me it is still fascinating to watch the through line of this stuff all connecting to where we are right now. I want to talk a little bit about, to finish things up here. And I mean, obviously, if there's any other thoughts about the book, I highly recommend Carson the Magnificent. Obviously, if you are watching this show here or listening to it, first off, what's wrong with you? Second, this is a book that will it probably will entertain you because again, it is.
Yes.
The one thing that Rob, and Allison both, I agree. I thought it was going to be a much thicker book because there was a lot of fanfare for a long time about this book. Bill signed this deal years and years ago that this book was going to come out. Everyone's saying, "Oh, when's the Zehme book coming out? When's the Zehme book coming out?"
It took him 20 years to get it out.
There you go. And so, and part of that too was just his perfectionism in the fact that it was too big for him and it became overwhelming. And I can certainly relate to that just because of the reverence that he had, but it finally did come out. And the fact that it isn't, a definitive 700-page textbook, essentially, it's not, it's a good read in the sense that if you do want an entry point into who Johnny Carson is, I think it's a wonderful entry point. I do think it touches on all of the things that we've talked about here, including some of the asides. But obviously this is the Letterman podcast, and many times I'm reading this book and I am just blown away by the comparisons and some of the similarities that Johnny and Dave shared through their careers. It's a lot more than I thought it was. A lot more. I always used to think that, okay, yeah, Carson started out as a magician. And oh, by the way, oh yeah, I mean, talking about that, there's a couple really cool things in the book about that. I love the idea that a lot of the magicians of the day would be summoned to Johnny's home in Malibu. They would come out there and they would have basically jam sessions where Johnny, who started out as a magician and always had a reverence for that art, and they would come out and do this together. I found that insanely charming.
It's a more exclusive club than the Magic Castle.
There you go. That's exactly right. And Johnny would spend time at the Magic Castle and yeah, I loved that. Obviously that's not something that Dave and Johnny share. Although it made me think about, like, Dave would have Magician Week, and many times it would be close-up magicians. Dave, good friends with Jeff Altman. Jeff Altman's a close-up magician as well as an insanely talented comedian and performer. But there were
quite a few people who are in entertainment have a background in magic. You look at Dick Cavett. I mean, Dick Cavett has a lot in common with Johnny Carson. Both are from Nebraska. Mm-hmm. Both dabbled in magic as well as comedy. Both ended up as a late night talk show host. Dick Cavett wrote for Jack Parr, and then he wrote for Johnny Carson, and then he got his own show. And of course, I mean, I know Dick Cavett has been on the Letterman podcast before, and
Yep.
I put something on the Carson Facebook page about Orson Welles. Maybe people didn't know that the great Orson Welles, he was a magician. And so you look at the title of the book, Carson the Magnificent,
Yep.
that's a nod to his days as a magician. And you think about, okay, maybe Johnny's best magic act was what he did on TV, because he transformed himself into a much different person. And any book about Johnny talks about that. Johnny was much different off camera than he was on camera. On camera, he was very charming, very witty, a great conversationalist, a great listener, really showed off his intelligence and all that stuff. But off camera, he was quite shy. He was quite awkward. Ed McMahon said Johnny was great with 10 people, or no, right, great with 10 million people, not so great with 10 people. So if he was at a party, Johnny would be in the corner doing card tricks or doing tricks with a coin, or, you know, he loved the close-up magic, but he knew that he had to transform himself. And he said that he was not comfortable in those small social situations, but when he was performing, he was in control. It was all about being in control. So if you're in front of an audience, everybody's eyes are on you. You're in control. You're calling the shots. So Johnny was a magician in more ways than one.
Oh, very, very well said. And it's funny, you know, they have a quote from one of the, and I forget the name of the textbook, but it's one of the magicians' Bibles that are out there, and they have 4 or 5 directions for an aspiring magician, and it's Zehme makes the comparison of how a comedian or a talk show host in this case here can take those same things and apply them, and the, you know, when you read them, you're like, oh, that's Johnny Carson to a T. And he took a lot of this training as a magician and transferred it over to being a performer or a comedian. Talking about these comparisons with he and Dave, you know, that's not one of them, obviously, but they're both drummers. Okay, so both enjoy drumming. You know, that's something, and you got to wonder. And I've wanted to ask Dave, did your love of drumming come from the idea that Johnny was a drummer? You know, and you wanted to emulate your.
And the book is Hoffin's Book of Magic.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you so much. You know, at one point, little facts. Carson owned a bank at one time. I thought that was interesting. I just thought that was, it was a failed business venture. He owned a bank. I thought that was
well, his joke. I mean, Bombastic Bushkin was his lawyer and his financial advisor, and a lot of times Johnny would say in his monologue, my lawyer, Bombastic Bushkin, he has some very shrewd business ideas for me. And then there'd be a joke. But yeah, Johnny dabbled in different things. He had his own restaurant chain for a while. I think it was just called Here's Johnny's. He wanted to buy a casino in Las Vegas, and he got into a bidding war with Wayne Newton. And so there's the whole story behind that. Wayne Newton shows up at Johnny's office and was not very happy with him, and because of some other issues too, that things that Johnny was saying on the air. But Wayne Newton basically wanted to get in a fist fight with Johnny. But yeah, there were other business ventures that Johnny did. He played Vegas
as well
for many years. I mean, he did stand up in Vegas. If you watch just go to YouTube, go to the 60 Minutes interview that Mike Wallace did. He has a clip of Johnny in Vegas, the Sahara Hotel there. So up until about 1980, that's how he would augment his income doing stand up in Vegas too.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, famously, Johnny Carson had a DeLorean because he had a stake in DeLorean as well, and things like that. Great point. So I've got a whole bunch of comparisons with Dave and Johnny. Both, you talk about his stand up. Really, at the end of the day, early in his career, he in between gigs, he kind of created sort of a makeshift act, but it wasn't his deal. He did not want to be a stand up. And I mean, Dave, same thing. I mean, very, very, very much not a stand up. Dave had an act, he had a hunk, he had material, and everyone who saw him thought he was fantastic at it, but it wasn't the love of his life. Stand-up was not the love of his life, which is interesting because Johnny, what is he most famous for? Like you say, a lot of people, they just watch the monologue, which many people do consider to be stand-up. It's a little bit different of a deal, than say a traditional stand-up, but stand-up's not his thing. And I mean, he had an act, but it wasn't the center point of his career, just like Dave. Both had shows that were canceled. We talked about that earlier. Both had the temptation thrust in front of them to make a nice career in game shows.
Mm-hmm.
Both Dave and Johnny could have gone down the game show path, but realized
I don't know about Dave.
No?
You've seen the Riddlers.
Yes, but there was, we had Adam Nedeff on here, and he and he talked about this, the idea that Dave was starting to get traction, and there's a theory out there that when he had he had a game show opportunity to be a host, he threw it. He threw it because it's like, no, this is not where I want to go. And there was a decision made going, this is not what I want to do. Yes, this could be a career, but this is not what I want to do. And I'm going to be focusing on moving in that direction. There, Johnny Carson, same thing, which I thought was really interesting as well.
Let's face it. I mean, in the 1970s, there were times when, Letterman needed money. He needed something to do. He did the Mary Tyler Moore variety show. He was on Mork and Mindy because his buddy Robin Williams from the Comedy Store got him on there. He had a very small part on there. He auditioned for the movie Airplane.
Mm-hmm.
So he just wanted to take different jobs because there were times when he just needed the money. But there, as far as Johnny and Dave, back then in the 70s, there was the way to make it in showbiz, and that was to go out to California, play and do stand up at the Comedy Store, the Improv, or wherever. And their goal was to have somebody notice them. With Johnny, it was Jim McCauley, his segment producer.
Yeah.
You wanted somebody from Carson's show to notice you and to get on Johnny's show. And that was why Dave moved from Indianapolis out to LA. It was like a clear path for him. And you look at somebody like Freddie Prinze. He did one episode of Johnny. The next day he gets the call from NBC and they say, we want to give you your own show. And that was Chico and the Man. So Johnny had so much power then as a star maker, especially with comedians.
Yeah, and Rory Rosegarden was on here last week. He talked about holding deals. David Letterman got a holding deal with NBC even after his show failed. He had a holding deal, and those don't really exist anymore. And again, all of that from the power of, Dave at that point was guest hosting. The Tonight Show, that's obviously a stark difference between the two. Kimmel and Conan, and Letterman hosted the Oscars too. Once. Kimmel's done it a bunch of times. I feel like if Conan does what I think he could do at this thing, this might be another thing. Johnny hosted, I think, 5 times. I think Johnny hosted the Oscars. It was
I think so, something like that.
Yeah. When I was
late
growing
70s,
up,
early 80s.
Yeah, late 70s, early 80s. See, when I was growing up, Billy Crystal was kind of considered sort of the mainstay of the Oscars, the reliable host, whatever. Johnny was that for the Academy Awards during that time. And I think it's worth noting that. Rob, you noted that, again, the parties thing, that was the thing I had written down as well. But, David Letterman, insane conversationalist, able to captivate millions of people. But at a party, he has gone on record talking about how he hates doing that. It's just interesting, all of the comparisons between the two. I'm so grateful that you two have taken time out of your Thanksgiving to come here and talk about this stuff. Any other thoughts on Carson the Magnificent or anything else that you wanted to? You've had a few days to prep for this, so any other thoughts that had gone through both of your minds before we button this episode up?
I think I really wanted to mention Whistle Falls because while it would never have worked on NBC, to me it sounds like a great Adult Swim show.
So what's Whistle Falls? For those
that
who
was
don't know
the show where it was a newspaper reporter who flew his own helicopter and got stranded on a desert island that had that was inhabited by puppets. That's an Adult Swim show. That's not an NBC show.
And that's Johnny.
That was Johnny. Like they made a pilot or
Yep.
they read the pilot script. I don't remember exactly. But I'm like, if someone pitched that to Adult Swim now,
Yep.
that would get at least a one episode pickup and they would throw it in paid programming and see how it goes.
Absolutely. Ahead of its time. You and I, Allison, in a paper that you just wrote, talked about, Dave's, the HBO offering that he had early on that was way ahead of its time.
Yes.
And, same sort of a thing. Both men, and this is a nice comparison, again, between the two, both men dabbled a little bit outside, in other projects, but no, did not really take. They were comfortable doing what they were by far the best at, better than anybody else at, and that was, of course, hosting this show. Whistle Falls, great call. What else? Anything else that that's left on the table? Any other scraps that we should talk about before we button this thing up? Rob, what do you got?
Well, I was looking at my notes. I think I pretty much covered everything on there, but I do have a prop here. I don't know if this was talked about in the book very much, but this, I found it really fascinating. Newsweek magazine from 1969.
Oh my
there
gosh,
was a 3-way competition in late night back then, which is commonplace now, but back then it was very unusual. But you had Merv Griffin on CBS versus Joey Bishop, who is a Rat Pack member. He was on ABC. And then Johnny on NBC. So you had the three of them, and of course Johnny won. But it's fascinating to think about that time in history. And I mean, back in 1962, if Johnny didn't make it as Tonight Show host, Merv Griffin was going to step in. Merv Griffin was right there. He started his daytime show on the same day that Johnny did. So Merv would have been more than happy to take that job, but things worked out fine for Johnny. But yeah, when you think of the 3-way race and you think of Joey Bishop and the fact that his sidekick was Regis Philbin, who was not very well known back then. People were like, Regis, who's this guy? So, and yeah, Joey Bishop was a Rat Pack member. So he was hanging out with Frank Sinatra and Sammy Davis Jr. and Dean Martin. And then when Joey went off, we mentioned Dick Cavett earlier. That slot went to Dick Cavett. Joey Bishop got canceled by ABC. And so then Dick Cavett stepped in and did his show for a few years. And Johnny said, he was concerned about Dick Cavett because he knew that Dick Cavett is very witty, very smart, a very good talk show host. So Johnny had said that if somebody was going to beat him in late night, it may have been Dick Cavett. It wasn't, Johnny still won, but he recognized Dick Cavett's array of talents.
Oh, Rob, I'm so glad that you just said and did what you did. I think about when Craig Ferguson went off the air, and this is something that maybe people can access in their lifetime, in their memory banks. I remember when Craig Ferguson went off the air, and I forget how long it was. It might have just been the summer. But they had the late show with Craig Ferguson set, and they had a whole bunch of people come in and do late shows in the time of preparing for James Corden to come in and take over late show. When Jack Parr retired from the Tonight Show, there was, I think it was 9 months. I think it was like between February and October when Johnny was going to take over, where everyone knew Johnny was going to take over. And they had guest hosts for the Tonight Show at the time. You just mentioned two of them. Joey Bishop was one of them. He hosted the Tonight Show in that interim. And, interesting, like you said, Rat Pack, remember, like this is a guy who there was a lot of juice behind it. And the other one, of course, who built an entertainment empire and has his own, stamp on this thing that we love, both with his daytime show, but also like with the things that and that's Merv Griffin. And the idea that, again, going back to, I only knew powerful Johnny, but back in the day, it wasn't that. In 93, the same thing happened when Letterman went over from NBC to CBS, and then Chevy Chase was on, and there were all these other, Arsenio was still around in syndication, Jay Leno, of course. And you didn't know where the cards were going to lay when they fell. And Johnny had one of those moments, and that's another comparison as well. He had to to make his bones while there was competition out there. And I think that is a wonderful, wonderful, observance as well that many people may not understand or know. Carson the Magnificent is certainly worth the read for those of us who enjoy this stuff here. I just want to say thank you very much and happy Thanksgiving to both of you. I appreciate the fact that we have this thing 2.5 years in. We have this community that's growing. I appreciate both of you being part of the Letterman podcast community. Thank you so much for everything that you both do, both in your perspectives in this world, what you're giving back. And I appreciate both your friendship. Thank you both for coming on here today.
Well, thank you very much for having us on. Talking about the parallels between Dave and Johnny, there was one other thing I want to mention.
Please do.
Johnny and Dave were very, very successful financially, and they both find it important to give back. Both of them have been very generous with their money. Mm-hmm. And you look at Johnny Carson, what he did, he gave millions and millions of dollars to his alma mater, which is the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. So then the media school there at Nebraska is the Johnny Carson School of Television and Film, or whatever it is. And so Dave probably, because Johnny did it, he did the same at his alma mater, Ball State. Mm-hmm. So the media building at Ball State University is the David Letterman Media Building. So I think that's pretty interesting, those two parallels there. So their stamp is on media for generations to come.
Oh, again, great point. Rob, I'm going to just say thank you to you because I know what it's like to be admin of a Facebook group that has, a few hundred people. And I understand, there's all sorts of stuff that comes with this and whatnot. Well, you are admin on some groups that have tens of thousands of people. And I just want to say, you don't do it for anything else. Like, I know you love being in broadcasting. You love your job in television. You're one of these guys. And we've talked about how many of the guys and gals who are in broadcasting, they have this affinity towards David Letterman and some of these other things that we love. I think that's a common thread with many of them. Darren Cox is a good example of that. Sure. There's another good shameless Darren Cox reference that we can throw into the episode. Excellent. He'll love that. But I just want to say thank you very much for being the admin of these things, because Facebook and groups like platforms like Facebook that have these groups where we can get together and talk about these things that we find in common. I think many times the idea of the echo chamber gets a bad rap these days, and I understand why. I get that. But at the same time, also being part of a fan club growing up was one of the only ways that I would ever connect with other fans. And Facebook has made it that much easier to do that. Well, you've been, you put in hours and hours and hours doing this. I'm certain, just like with my family, with all the things that I do, with the things that I love, many times they kind of, Mike, you got to go and do this. Yeah, I do. I got to do this. This is important to me, right? I'm certain the same thing happens with you. And I just wanted to say publicly, Rob, thank you so much for administering these pages. You're connecting a lot of people by doing this. It's a labor of love. So thank you very much for doing that, Rob.
Well, yeah, you're welcome. I enjoy it, and it's just good to be with like-minded people. Not everybody is a late night geek, and not everybody really likes to delve deep into this stuff. But I really do. I mean, that's why I like your podcast. I love the Carson podcast that Mark used to do. I love Conan's podcast, Fly on the Wall, the Saturday Night Live guys. Yeah, those are outstanding. So I really like doing it, and it's just really and it's a way to meet people that you normally wouldn't have met. I mean, I met, meeting both of you through this, and I don't know anyone else in Canada. I don't. I don't know any other Canadians. So it's great to establish friendships through those groups with people that are really passionate about that stuff, like I am.
Well, and when you, as you know now, when you become friends with a Canadian, that friendship has a distinct maple syrup flavor. Seriously, Rob, I am really grateful. Like early on when I started this, you immediately attached yourself as somebody who would support this thing. It's been far too long since we've had you on, so again, thank you so much for that support. I really appreciate it a lot. And whenever I get a message from you where you've watched an episode or listened to an episode, or you throw something publicly out there and you talk about how much you love what we're doing here, again, I can't thank you enough for that. That means a lot to me. And Allison, I love our friendship. I love when you share, some of the papers you're working on with me and stuff. And I just love that you're somebody of your generation is grabbing the torch that Rob and I have, and we've been carrying, and we enjoy. And I'm so grateful that you're around here. Thank you for being you, and for appearing on the
Thank
show
you.
again.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
I
All
think
right.
it's 3 times for both of us. So isn't that right, Allison? This is your third time?
No, it's my fourth.
Oh,
Yeah,
you're
it's
fourth.
Allison's
Okay.
fourth. That's right.
Okay, so you're one ahead of me. Yeah, it's 3 for me. But I know how SNL has that 5 timers club where they have their
Yeah.
robes with a 5 on it. So I'm in the 3 timers club, and you're in the 4 timers club.
Yes, you need like Letterman podcast mugs for people who hit that mark.
Oh,
Sure,
you know what?
definitely.
The thing, I got plans. If we can get this thing to a place where I'm able to spend a little bit more time and effort doing it. It's not, I hate to say it's about money, but at the end of the day, you got to keep the lights on. You got to keep doing that. I'm a financial planner by trade, but the plans that I have, or the ideas that I have for this thing, and it all comes down to community. If we can build a community as things get bigger, things like this can happen. But regardless, I said this to somebody else the other day in the Letterman world. I've already won. People are like, oh, what if it became this? What if it became that? Yes, that would be great if it did. But at the end of the day, I've already won because I have developed all of these friendships and relationships and connection points with not just people who worked for the show or whatnot. That's great. I love that. But also because of people like you, because of the people who do reach out, people who have stomached this episode up to this point. I appreciate you. Those are the ones who reach out to me. And I mean, I get a kick out of that in the middle of my day. If I'm at my office, a client just leaves or something, and I need a palate cleanser, I might look at my emails. I might look into some of the things here. And I always get messages from people who appreciate the stuff that we're talking, even if they don't appreciate me necessarily, they appreciate the stuff we're talking about, and they stomach me because they have that same the need for connectivity when it comes to these things. And I think it's important. You're both very positive people, and I just appreciate the beacons of light that you both are in our world. So thank you both for being part of the Letterman podcast community. I just want to say thank you to everybody else out there. I hope you have had a happy Thanksgiving. This episode is coming out real time. Some of them are in the can when they do come out. Not this one here. It's coming out right at the American Thanksgiving. Of course, we in Canada celebrated last month, early harvest, as we like to say. Oh, also today, it's Paul Schaefer's birthday. So let's say a happy birthday to Paul Schaefer. This has been another episode of the Letterman podcast with Mike Chisholm. Coincidentally, I am Mike Chisholm. Thank you and good night.
Overcoat and underpants.